So I'm going to show you a picture. It's a picture of an athlete trying to qualify his country for an Olympic Games. And this is a moment of realization. It's a race which could set his country up for an improbable success. And this is the moment that he crosses the finish line in that picture. It is a picture of failure. Now, what is there that could be said on failure that is not already said? Generally, there's a couple of flavors of talks on failure. The first is where someone might stand up on a stage and say, I'm a success, look at me, and I've failed many times. Hundreds, thousands, fail like me, and you could be a success as well. Another flavor of talk would be if somebody says, well, failure is simply an opportunity. One door closing as another opens. The problem with talks like these is that they're filled with platitudes, and when we listen to platitudes, we are inspired for all of 5 minutes. But there's no roadmap for change. There's no reason to actually make something of your situation. And so I could stand up here, and I can say what I'm going to say, give a lecture on how fail is a 4-letter F word. I can get you inspired, nod your heads for all 5 minutes. But ultimately, it would be pointless, because there would be no call to action. So instead, I've come to talk to you today about failure from my perspective, how I feel that how we view failure is toxic, how we might better view failure, and I'm going to give you a lesson on how we can turn failure in our lives into success. So, I'm AJ Edelman, Israel's Olympic skeleton athlete. For the 99% of you guys who don't know what skeleton is, and the 1% who Googled it before you came in here, skeleton is a sport where an athlete of highly questionable judgment starts sprinting down an ice tunnel and then dives headfirst onto a lunch tray. And that's where the fun begins, because he then navigates that lunch tray at speeds of up to 90 miles an hour down a mile-long bobsled track, chin an inch from the ice, steering with his head, shoulders, knees, and toes, experiencing G-forces that a fighter pilot and a Formula One driver experience. And there are no breaks. If you're wondering how you win in such a delightfully painful sport, it's quite simple. The fastest time to the bottom, still holding on to your lunch tray, still in one piece, and still conscious, takes the gold. I got you guys. You don't need to actually be conscious. It's happened. Now, 5 years ago, on my 23rd birthday, Israel and I were given a very glowing scouting report, perhaps one of the greatest scouting reports in the history of my sport. It said, in short, that I would never be competitive in this sport. I was not equipped for it. I did have physical limitations that should have prevented me from becoming successful in skeleton. But the second thing that happened that day is that I decided that for the next 2,884 days, the days that remained until the 2022 Olympic Games, I would not rest until Israel qualified for the Olympics in skeleton. Representing Israel has been the greatest honor of my life, and I held that oath to be sacred. And Israel didn't end up qualifying for 2022. It qualified for 2018. Now, someone with such a dire scouting report does seem quite destined for failure, though, doesn't he? I would say so. At the time, I was going to be living the engineer's dream. I graduated from MIT. I had a job set up, very lucrative one, at Oracle in California. But I decided to give it a go. And I've experienced failure thousands of times in my skeleton career, if not more. But amongst those times, what it's given me is an opportunity on how to view failure, but more importantly, tools on how to address failure. So how do we view failure? Classically and problematically, we teach our children that failure is when we attempt to accomplish something and we fall short of it. But that's a really toxic definition, because if falling short is all it takes in order for something to be classified as a failure, then failure is simply defined as something permanent and rooted in negativity. Once I've experienced failure, once I've fallen short, that situation, though it could be built upon, that situation is forever a success, is forever a failure. And that is why I believe that no matter how many inspirational words or speeches we hear, ultimately, trying to remove what is a permanent stain is incredibly difficult. But what if failure isn't permanent? Is how we view failure incorrect? I certainly believe so, and I think that internalizing this can change our lives. So, allow me to please recount a story to you which drastically changed my view of failure. Sports, just as a background, are a breeding ground of failure. Every single day, athletes set out goals and objectives, and we either hit those goals or we fall short of them. And oftentimes, we fall short. And those failures can add up and become mentally very grating, contributing to athlete burnout. Skeleton, also for reference, is too fast a sport for an athlete to adapt to, at least initially. The G-forces and going at 90 miles an hour is basically not what the body was designed to do. And so for the first 100 runs, an athlete doesn't even know if he's going up or down in a skeleton corner. Compounding issues for me was that I literally couldn't see. I was blind. Why was I blind? Because my head was dragging on the ice the entire way. I couldn't hold my head up in the corners. And so every time I went down, I couldn't see a single thing. And I raced to get to this magic 100-run threshold. This threshold, which I was told, is when a skeleton athlete starts to learn if he can drive or not, if he can feel. And I was fanatical about getting Israel to the games. I absolutely was. With the amount of doubt that we were given as a program, I vowed that we would never be outworked. And so, as a normal skeleton athlete takes 2 to 3 runs a day, I took on average 5 to 6, sometimes up to 9. I stood on Christmas Eve, I stood on New Year's Eve, I stood on my birthdays and Thanksgiving. I didn't take a vacation, and I didn't see my family at all during the season. I didn't see loved ones. I did everything I could to qualify Israel for the games. Israel, bobsled and skeleton athletes are on the hook for 100% of their season's cost, which can run into the 6 figures per year. And so, as I couldn't afford to hire a traveling coach, I watched 8 to 10 hours of video per day in order to develop neural pathways to become a better driver. Nothing was going to stop me from progressing in this sport. Now, the issue that I experienced was that when you're running against the clock and you try to overwork yourself, you might experience some form of mental difficulties and burnout. And that eventually came into play. It's what I was warned about. But by the second year, Israel had progressed far above and beyond what we had anticipated. And so Oracle, at the time, they'd given me graciously a leave of absence under the agreement that I'd come back during the summer and spring months in order to work. It's how I planned on affording my seasons. But by the end of the second year of sliding, I'd proceeded to utterly destroy myself for 2 seasons. And I thought in order to up my game, in order to give Israel any chance of qualification, we would have to up our game. I would have to go to the extreme. And so I made a very poorly informed decision. I went to the most brutal track I could go to for the longest. This was without a doubt the most painful time in my skeleton career. A couple years before, when I had raced to that 100-run threshold, I got to that 100-run threshold, and I still couldn't see. I still couldn't feel. Every day, I had been writing down notes in a notebook. Skeleton athletes take copious amounts of notes after each and every run. And so I traveled to Sigolda with a notebook filled with all the failures of my previous sliding. For 30 runs, after those initial 100 runs that I had mentioned, there were nothing but expletives in my notebook because I couldn't feel a single thing. But finally, run 131 in my notebook lists some small success. It said, I might feel something, maybe this will go somewhere. And so I arrived in Sigolda with this circled, but ultimately proceeded to break almost every rib that I had. It was utterly demoralizing. I was lucky if I was able to lift myself off the sled at the end of the run under my own power without delay. 2 years to the day, a month after this began, 2 years to the day of the 2,884-day promise that I made to myself, I found myself on my 25th birthday at 1 a.m. in a gym at the track. And finally, I had burnt out. And so I decided to quit. Thought, no more spending my life savings. I'll go back to California. No more pain. No more runs. It's over. And this is what I'd always been taught failure was, falling short of the goal. And so at that point, I defined myself as a former failed skeleton athlete. And I packed up my stuff and I left. But as I left town, on the train back to Riga, I opened my notebook. And I realized that there were hundreds of pages, of thousands of mistakes, thousands of failures, including those 30 runs of nothing but swear words. And I thought, well, I've just resigned myself to failing in the worst way. I've stolen Israel's chance at Olympic qualification, because if Israel wanted to qualify, I was the only one who was able to do it. So what was I going to do now? What was I going to do with this scenario? Those hundreds of pages, each of them, had early on failures that by the later pages had ceased to be failures at all. And I thought, maybe if I write down this failure in my notebook, something will come of it. I could work to progress. And so that day, instead of utterly resigning myself to that failure, I instead quit my job at Oracle in order to train full-time, even in the off-season, and I circled and wrote down something in my notebook, something which I've gone back to every single time I've experienced failure. It's a rallying cry. Trust in the process, and it will work out. I bet on myself. 9 months later, that picture of failure was taken. And that evening, I went back into my notebook, I looked, I thought, I can do this. I'm here. The next day I went out and put in the best sliding performance that Israel had had to date. So what is failure truly? Failure is not something permanent. Failure is something that can change. We don't build on failure to achieve success. Failure literally becomes success. Failure is not trying and falling short of a goal, that's disappointment. Failure is not making a bad decision, that's a mistake. But failure is probably more akin to a broken bone. If you mend to it, if you care for it, and you tend to it, it will mend itself stronger than ever before and purge itself of what it was. But if you ignore it, it will fester and it will become a permanent deformity. In dealing with this, it's an incredibly powerful tool. Because the only time that we could say that we've failed then is when we don't address failure at all. And that turns failure from something that is defining into something that we define ourselves. And this is a lesson which stuck with me all the way to the Olympic Games. In a previous TEDx talk, I spoke on a very difficult scenario. I had 16 hours before my Olympic competition where Israel was unfairly targeted for an equipment disqualification. It threatened to derail my entire performance. I only had one opportunity in that 16 hours to slide with a completely new setup, and it went disastrously wrong. I was paralyzed with fear of failure, but that evening somebody sent me a picture from the end of that training session. I'd realized when I saw that picture, I'd seen that posture before. It was the exact same pose. It's the only times in my skeleton career that I looked like this. And so I went back into my notebook, I bet on myself, and the next day I put in an absolutely great performance at the Olympic Games. And so failure requires hard work to be transformed literally into success. But how can we do it? I promised I would give you a tool, and so I will. I'll give you one tool, and that is keep a journal of successes and of failures. Take down everything that you could remember about each and every one of them. If failure is a broken bone to you, your job is to spend a few minutes per day rehabbing that failure until you are confident enough to call it literally part of a success. Both of these scenarios were utter failures at the time, but by the next days, they had become parts of brilliant successes. And this is so much more powerful a tool. It's a much more powerful a tool than listening to words or speeches, because this is action. It's meaningful, demonstrable, observable action. And it's not a silver bullet. But if it could help you redefine how you view failure in your life, ultimately you'll come to find that you can utterly purge failure at all. You'll be living a life free of failure and a better, more successful version of yourself. Thank you very much for having me.